Hello and welcome. In this video, we're going to revisit our fundamentals demo, and specifically, we are going to look at our registrant class. Now, we saw our registrant class in an earlier video that focused on the array list with objects, and we started embellishing this class with some basic fields, and we'd like to continue that now in this video. Basically, we want to make this class a little more useful. So to begin with, we want to sort of think of what a registrant is. It might be a registrant for an event, a conference, etc. And we'd like to get some more information about the registrant, particularly their first name, last name. And then we also want to track, for instance, whether the registrant object itself is actually complete. And so we'll see a couple of different ways to go about doing this. In addition, we are going to control the scope of the variables and how they can be accessed. For instance, you'll notice from the previous work that we've done, we now have private variables for both username and for active, but we have public methods that allow for us to control the access to the information. Particularly if you notice, we have a get username, but we have no set username. In other words, this allows for us to set the username when we create the registrant, but later on it cannot be changed. Now, we're going to spend a lot more time talking about this in later videos, but for right now, what we're going to do is we're going to focus on this pattern of creating these get and set functions or methods that allow for us to control the access to the information in conjunction with the scope of the variables. And so to begin with, what we want to do is we want to go ahead and create variables that'll hold some additional information. And we're going to keep this one fairly simple in that we're going to store the first name as well as the last name of the registrant. And then in addition to that, what we want to do is we want to store then the status of the variable itself or the object itself. Now, this, to be fair, is not completely required. However, though, we're going to use this for a couple of reasons. Number one, for convenience when it comes to verifying the registrant itself is a valid object, but also it gives us a great opportunity to look at the advantages of an enumerator over, for instance, our Boolean active. Again, we've got a couple of different ways to go about doing this, but the easiest way is to go ahead and create a enum on the same level as the registrant, and we are simply going to call this status. And we're going to have three status. One is going to be unknown, the next will be complete, and the third will be incomplete. Now we can continue with whatever other status we might need to have, but at the very least, these will be the three states or three status that we care about for now. Additionally, we could have created this inside the registrant class itself, thereby making it tied to the registrant. But if anything, what I want to do is I want to think of this status as being more of a system status or a global status that when we start investigating other classes, we can potentially use it there as well. Now, just like with the other private variables, we need to create a storage space for this particular enum if we intend to store it inside of the registrant. And again, what we'll do is we'll have private, in this case, it'll be EE333.status, and we will again just use the lowercase for the private variable names. You hopefully have picked up on this pattern here that I have been using lowercase letters for my private variable names. At this point, then what we want to do is continue with modifying our class and what will be accessible and not accessible. And we'll do a little bit of organization here. First thing that I like to personally do is I like to put all of my getters and setters near the top of the class description immediately following our private variables. Again, this is not required, but it just sort of helps us to see exactly how our class is laid out. Alternatively, you can also push your constructors to the top. Again, it just helps with being able to read the code. And so working again with our registrant constructor, we have to remember that we should always set default values for the variables that are not handled explicitly in the constructor. So if you recall from last time, we have a constructor for a registrant that allows for us to pass the username. And then we set the username. We technically don't do any sort of error checking. We'll come back to that later on. But then we also set a default value for the Boolean active status, and that is going to be false. We want to do the same thing now with the other local variables we've created. So we'll do this dot first name, and since we were not provided anything for the first name, then we simply set that equal to empty double quotes. We do the same with our last name, empty double quotes, and then we also want to do the same thing with our status. And in this case, what we can do again is we will leverage our EE333.status, and with an additional dot, we can then see the states that are available to us in our status enum. And obviously, we don't have all of the information that we need to have a fully valid registrant. Particularly, we're missing the first name and last name. So in this case, we would probably want to go ahead and change the state to either incomplete or unknown. Now, some of these decisions will be made for you as you start building your applications, depending on what your customer wants and everything like that. But in the very least, we're just going to go ahead and set this to incomplete to indicate that the registrant itself is not a completed object. Now, the next thing that we want to do is we want to consider another registrant constructor. In other words, how much information do we actually have available about the registrant when they first attempt to register? Translation, when we create the object. Well, it's possible that in addition to the username, you also have the first name, last name, perhaps not their active status. But at this point, we can go ahead and create an additional constructor, again, spelled the exact same way as the class itself. But what we do is we provide additional arguments to the constructor. And I'm going to cheat a little bit here since I know that they will all be strings. I'm simply going to copy and paste some of this. But the first one will be the username. The second one will be first name. And the third one will be last name. And at this point, then, what we want to do is we also want to do some error checking. And I cannot emphasize this enough here that we're not going to do it yet, but you do need to do some basic error checking. In other words, check to make sure that the username is not null. It is longer than a 0 length. First name and last name likewise. But what we're going to do is we're going to focus first on the process here, and that is simply of assigning the individual arguments to their corresponding local variables. And in this case, it's just going to be a simple mapping from username to username, first name to first name, and so on. And hopefully you've noticed or can see the difference here that on the left side, I'm using the this. That corresponds to the local variable associated with the object. The variable name on the right-hand side corresponds to the input argument. And yes, while they are spelled the same, they do represent two different variables in two different places in memory. The one on the left, if anything, can be thought of as a field of an object, but it's a private variable or a private allocation of memory. The same as far as the default value. For the active here, we're just going to simply set it equal to false. And then now we have to decide, do we actually have enough information about the user to claim that their status is in fact complete? And so again, we would want to do some error checking. I'm going to do that in a later video, but fundamentally we have all of the information we need about the registrant object at this point. From here, we can proceed now to some additional functions here. Particularly, we have our get username, our is active, which we set up in an earlier video. You could argue could be changed. As a matter of fact, I'm going to go ahead and make that change just for the purposes of consistency. I'm going to change this now from is active to get active and put a little note here, previously known as is active. Again, this is nothing more than a change in terminology, doesn't really affect the functionality of our application. We will have to make some changes in our driver in just a little bit to keep consistent. But what we can do now is we can have this pattern of these gets and sets for each one of our fields. Now, you can agree, hopefully, that your username may not change after you have initialized or constructed the object, but the first and last names are probably okay to change. In other words, maybe there was some change or misspelling, for instance, when the applicant first registered, etc. And so in this case, what we want to do is we want to go ahead and create then, in this case, a public getter and setter. We'll start with our first name and we'll have get first name. Again, it's going to be a return type of java.lang.string. And in order to get the first name, we don't necessarily have to provide any input arguments. We simply then return our this dot first name. It's pretty straightforward. For the set, what we want to do is, again, have a public. And in this case, you can decide, or we will have this discussion about whether there should be a return value. For right now, we're going to set it as void. And so we're going to have a set first name method. And in this case, it again needs to have a java.lang.string. Much like our constructor, we'll have a input argument, a first name, and in this case, it's going to be this dot first name equal to first name. Now, as always, whenever we set a field, we need to consider doing some error checking or validation. In other words, we don't want to accidentally create a problem by setting one of our internal variables to null or a zero length after, for instance, it had a valid value to begin with. So we'll come back to this. Again, we're going to do quite a bit of validation, quite a bit of improvement on this. Right now, we're just going to put a little note here that we need to do this. And then we're going to do the same thing now with our last names. So we're going to have java.lang.string, and then we'll have our get last name that again does not require an input argument. And then this dot last name will be what is returned. And then lastly, we're going to have a public void again and a set last name. Again, hopefully you can see why you would want the ability to set someone's last name. And again, need to do some validation here or error checking, whatever you would like to call it. And then we will have our this dot last name, and we need to accept as an input argument for this method, again, a java.lang.string last name as an input argument, and we'll simply assign then that value to our local variable or our object level variable. Now, at this point, we have gotten our basic getters and setters handled. We should probably consider whether or not we want the status of the object to be able to be communicated back to whoever is consuming this object. At the very least, you would argue that externally, you should not have the ability to set the status. And so if anything, what we'll have is we'll have one more method that returns EE333.status, and we'll simply call this one then get status. Again, probably not logical for us to have a setter, because if anything, this variable, the status enum, should be controlled internal to the object. But in this case, we could definitely return the status by just simply returning this dot status, and we'll leave the setter alone. Now, at this point, we probably want to go ahead and update then our toString. And so we'll have our results plus equal. We'll follow this up now with our first name. And again, you can embellish this however much you'd like. You can make it look as fancy as you would like. The idea is that it's supposed to tell you a little bit about the object when you make a call to the toString method. Do the same thing then for the last name. And then the other question that you want to ask yourself is, does the consumer of this object need to know anything about its internal status? Again, it's up to you. It's again up to the application, what your customer may want, etc. But for us, one of the benefits to doing this is we get to see how to handle an enum from the string perspective. And so if anything, what we'd like to do is go ahead and add the status in for now. You can simply remove this by commenting out this particular line in your toString. So again, I think at this point, we've probably made the changes that we need to so far in our object. The additional one that we could consider adding in there might be some sort of is valid or validate method, but we will handle that then in a later video when we start talking about valid field values, etc. And so at this point, we're going to go ahead and save it. We'll probably need to make some sort of changes in our driver as well, but for now, let's go ahead and build it, see if we have any errors or warnings. And so far, everything seems to be okay. And then we'll come over here to our fundamentals demo, and we're going to need to create an additional function then that will allow for us to demo our new registrant. So I'm going to go ahead and split the screen for just a second, and I'm going to create a little helper function down here in the list of our functions, and I'm just going to call it public static void. And how about if we call it registrant demo? And at this point, then what we want to do is don't forget to go ahead and put your comment block in here, and then go ahead and add some additional information. We are going to have no return value. As a matter of fact, we're actually going to hard code a number of values in here just to prove that our registrant is in fact working the way that we would like to see it work. And so we'll start off here by having a EE333 registrant, and we'll keep this very dry, very simple, if you would. We're going to call this one registrant underscore 01. We're also going to have an EE333 registrant, and we'll say registrant O2. Notice here that I am simply declaring them. I'm not calling the constructor or anything like that. I'm not trying to initialize them. And so at this point, then what we would like to do is we would like to test both of our constructors. And we'll start with the one that we've used in the past, and that is going to be the constructor with the single argument. And so we'll just do that with our registrant 01. And we'll just simply say is equal to new EE333 registrant. And you'll see that I now have both of my constructors there listed. And I'm just going to use my Blazor ID or my user ID. And then what we really want to see happen is we want to see what the results are of creating this object using that constructor. And the easiest way to go about doing this is by just making a call to our system.out.println, and what we can do is we can use the toString method of our registrant 01. And again, if we've made the appropriate changes in our toString, we should get the additional fields that we have set up in the registrant class. Now, as we said earlier, we now have a registrant object, and we have initialized the username to whatever was passed to the constructor. We do need to do some error checking and some validation there, but the rest of the values should be default. And so what we'd like to do is we'd like to use this opportunity to go ahead and check to see that our setters are working correctly at this point. And so what we can do here is we're going to go ahead and try to set, not sure what my autocomplete did there for me. Let's try that again. It keeps wanting to jump here. So let's try to type out a few more letters here. So there's my set first name. There we go, much better. And I'm just going to go ahead and put in my first name followed by our set last name. And again, you'll see here that I am providing that information as arguments to these methods. And then what we want to do is we then want to repeat a call to our system.out.println and the toString method of our registrant 01. Now, to help make this a little cleaner, I'm going to go ahead and throw in a couple more system.out.printlns. And specifically what I'm going to do is I'm going to have just a little barrier or table border, whatever you'd like to call it, just for aesthetic reasons between these calls so we can sort of see then how this is playing out. All right, likewise, we want to do the same thing with our second registrant, but the difference being here is we are going to give the constructor all or as much of the information as we have available up front, and that includes my user ID, my first name, and my last name, in double quotes because they're all strings. And at this point, then what we can do is we can simply make another call to our system.out.println. And in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to leverage the registrant_02.toString method. And you should see then the information as well as the default values associated with that second registrant. And again, I'm simply going to put a border in here. At this point, we are finished with our little helper function for now. We're going to come back and we'll make some modifications to it in later videos. But what we want to do is now set this up so that we can see it in action in our main. And we'll do this by simply setting up a couple more switches, or in this case, a switch with a couple of switches here. So it's going to be args.length. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to have two arguments, and the first argument, args square bracket 0 equals ignore case. And what we'll do is we'll specify /registrant to indicate what I am in fact trying to test. And if that's equal to true, as well as the second argument. And so I'm actually going to do a little selective copying and pasting here to speed this up so that my arg square brackets 1 is equal to the demo. And if those two are correct, I simply want to make a quick call to my registrant demo. Now, note here that I can call it directly, or again, I can simply specify ee333.fundamentalsdemo.registrantDemo. Save it. We'll go ahead and build it. And we can pop out to our command window. We can run our Java ee333.fundamentalsdemo. and then registrant, and then demo. And if we don't have any typos, we should see the results of the first constructor call where we only passed my username, followed by the first name, which essentially is zero-length string that was internally set in the constructor to a default value. Likewise with the last name, status is incomplete as a result. We go down here, we change or we set the first name and last name, but we have not yet written into our code any validations. So fundamentally, it's still incomplete. We'll come back to that in a later video, but you'll notice when I pass all the information at once, because we have set this up in such a way that we set the default to complete, then you'll see on the command line, again, the status is complete, active is still false in all three of these examples, and that's perfectly fine. But you'll notice also too that the status, when you do a toString on a status, it provides the friendly name for the status, not the numerical value associated with it. So at this point, we are probably done with the early modifications of our registrant class. We'll be using this in subsequent videos. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to email me. And thank you for watching.